Everyone thought it was over. Not just a career dip, not just bad press, but a complete Hollywood shutdown. Johnny Depp went from being one of the most loved stars on the planet to someone studios were afraid to even mention. Roles disappeared, contracts collapsed, and the man who defined Captain Jack Sparrow was suddenly replaced by silence. But here's the twist no one expected. 2026 isn't about survival anymore, it's about a savage comeback. The question is not, can he return? The real question is, WHO tried to erase him, and why did it fail? The moment everything started collapsing didn't look dramatic on the surface. There was no explosion, no headline that screamed the end instantly. Instead, it came quietly, like a slow erasure. One decision at a time, one contract at a time, one silence after another. Johnny Depp had spent decades building a reputation not just as a movie star but as a shapeshifter, someone who could disappear into roles so completely that audiences forgot the man behind them. From eccentric outsiders to legendary pirates, he wasn't just acting. He was creating identities that became part of pop culture itself. But in a matter of months, that entire image was questioned. Not because of a failed movie, not because audiences turned away, but because of something far more dangerous in modern Hollywood. Perception. Suddenly, studios that once fought to sign him became silent. Projects that were already in motion stopped moving. The whispers turned into headlines, and the headlines turned into decisions. And those decisions came fast. One of the most defining moments came when the Walt Disney Company chose to distance itself. This wasn't just another studio. This was the home of Pirates of the Caribbean, the franchise that gave the world Captain Jack Sparrow, a character so iconic that it blurred the line between fiction and reality. When Disney stepped back, it wasn't just a business move. It was a signal to the entire industry, and the industry listened. Offers slowed down, then stopped. Brands pulled away. The same system that once celebrated individuality now demanded distance. What made it worse was the speed of it all. There was no pause to wait, no moment to question, no space for context. Decisions were made in real time, driven by headlines rather than conclusions. And here's where things get even more intense. Because while the public saw fragments, the real story was unfolding in courtrooms. The legal battle between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard wasn't just another celebrity dispute. It became one of the most publicly dissected cases in recent history. Every statement, every clip, every testimony was analyzed by millions. During the Depp v. Heard trial, something unexpected happened. Instead of fading away, the situation pulled global attention back toward him. People weren't just reading headlines anymore. They were watching everything unfold in real time. Hours of testimony, cross-examinations, evidence presented piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, the narrative wasn't controlled by short headlines. It was shaped by long-form exposure. Interviews and statements presented during the trial began to shift how people saw the situation. Legal teams brought forward recordings, messages, and witness accounts. For example, audio recordings that were played in court and widely reported by outlets like BBC News and the New York Times became key discussion points, as they allowed audiences to hear interactions directly rather than rely on secondhand interpretation. This wasn't about immediate redemption, but it was the first crack in the narrative that had defined the previous years. Public opinion doesn't change overnight, but it does shift when people feel like they're seeing something unfiltered. Social media played a massive role here. Clips went viral, reactions spread, and suddenly the conversation wasn't one-sided anymore. It became divided, then gradually more balanced. And that shift mattered. Because Hollywood doesn't just follow facts. It follows perception. And perception was changing. Still, the damage was real. Years had passed. Opportunities were lost. Momentum was gone. And in an industry where relevance moves at high speed, even a small pause can feel like the end. Many believed that even if public opinion softened, the system itself wouldn't take the risk of bringing him back. But what most people underestimated was something much deeper. Resilience. Instead of chasing immediate redemption, Johnny Depp moved differently. He stepped away from the typical Hollywood spotlight and focused on projects that didn't rely on major studios. International films, artistic collaborations, music. Moves that didn't scream comeback, but quietly rebuilt presence. This wasn't accidental, because when someone has been publicly removed, the worst move is to appear desperate, and that's exactly what he avoided. At the same time, interviews began to surface where he addressed the situation in a controlled way. In conversations reported by The Hollywood Reporter and Variety, he spoke about feeling betrayed by the industry but also made it clear that he wasn't chasing validation anymore. That shift in tone mattered. It wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about standing firm. And slowly, something unusual started happening. Audiences didn't just remember the controversy. They remembered the work. The performances, the characters, the uniqueness that made him different from everyone else. Especially the legacy of Captain Jack Sparrow, a role that no one else had been able to replicate or replace. Studios pay attention to one thing above all else: demand. And demand was coming back. Fan campaigns started appearing again. Discussions about whether anyone could truly replace him gained traction. And even though no official announcements were made, the conversation itself became valuable. Because in Hollywood, conversation often comes before decisions. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because a comeback isn't just about being accepted again. It's about whether the system that once rejected you is willing to reverse itself. And that's rare. Very rare. Most careers that fall this hard don't return to the same level. They shift, they adapt, but they don't reclaim what was lost. Which is why what started happening next began to feel different. Not loud, not immediate, but strategic. The silence that once surrounded him started to change tone. It wasn't absence anymore. It was anticipation. And the question slowly evolved from, "Is he finished?" to something much more powerful. What if this isn't the end at all? What if this is the setup for something bigger? What if everything that looked like a downfall was actually building pressure for a return no one saw coming? Because when silence turns into anticipation, the entire game changes. And that's exactly where things started shifting in a way that even critics couldn't ignore. After the dust of the Daft Heard trial began to settle, the conversation didn't disappear. It evolved. Instead of focusing only on controversy, people began revisiting the timeline. What actually happened, how fast decisions were made, and whether those decisions were based on complete information. This wasn't driven by studios. This was driven by the audience. And when the audience starts asking questions, the industry listens differently. You could see it in small but important signals. Interviews started carrying a different tone. In discussions covered by Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, insiders hinted at something that rarely gets said openly: that the situation had become more complicated than the original narrative suggested. No direct admissions, no dramatic reversals, but enough to suggest that the door wasn't completely closed anymore. And in Hollywood, a slightly open door is everything. At the same time, Johnny Depp wasn't trying to force his way back through it. Instead of announcing big studio deals or chasing headlines, he kept building quietly. Projects outside the traditional system, appearances that felt selective, not desperate. This created something powerful. Control. Because the moment a comeback feels forced, it loses value. But when it feels earned, it becomes a story. And this was turning into a story. Fans didn't just support him. They organized around him. Social media campaigns gained traction, not in a chaotic way, but in a consistent, persistent way. Discussions about Captain Jack Sparrow returned stronger than expected. People weren't just nostalgic. They were making a point. That some characters are tied so closely to the actor that replacing them breaks the connection completely. And studios noticed that. Especially the Walt Disney Company, whether publicly or privately, couldn't ignore the numbers. Streaming data, engagement, fan demand. These are the metrics that actually drive decisions behind the scenes. And the data was saying something clear. The interest hadn't died. It had been waiting. But here's where things get more intense. Because the return isn't just about demand. It's about trust. And trust in Hollywood is fragile. Once it breaks, rebuilding it requires more than just popularity. It requires leverage. And that leverage began to shift after the trial's outcome and the public response that followed. While not every opinion changed, enough did to create balance. And balance is all you need to reopen negotiations. Because now, the conversation wasn't about risk alone. It was about opportunity. Think about it. A comeback story at this scale isn't just another casting decision. It's a global narrative. From canceled to comeback. From silence to spotlight. That kind of arc doesn't just sell tickets. It creates attention before a single frame is shot. And Hollywood runs on attention. Reports and commentary from outlets like BBC News continued to analyze the cultural impact of the case, showing how deeply it had influenced public perception and media behavior. This wasn't just about two individuals anymore. It became a case study in how quickly reputations can be built and destroyed in the digital age. And more importantly, how they can be rebuilt. Behind the scenes, conversations were happening. Not official announcements, not confirmed deals, but discussions. Because once the numbers start making sense again, the same industry that walked away starts recalculating. But this time, the power dynamic isn't the same. Before, he needed the system. Now, the system might need the story. And that changes everything. Because if a return to something like Pirates of the Caribbean ever happens, it won't look like it did before. It won't be just another sequel. It will be positioned as an event, a moment, a statement, and a kind of positioning gives leverage back to the person who lost it. Which leads to a question most people aren't asking yet. What if the delay wasn't a weakness? What if it was strategy? Because time, in this case, didn't erase relevance. It amplified it. Every year without him in that role made the absence more noticeable. Every attempt to imagine a replacement made the original more valuable. And value, in Hollywood terms, translates directly into negotiation power. So when people say come back, they often imagine a return to where things were. But this doesn't feel like that. This feels like a reset. A chance to come back not as someone trying to recover, but as someone redefining the terms. And that's where things become unpredictable. Because a controlled comeback is one thing, but a savage comeback is something else entirely. It's not just about returning. It's about proving a point. And the signs of that kind of return are subtle but clear. The shift in tone, the growing demand, the quiet positioning, all of it building towards something that hasn't been officially confirmed but is becoming harder to dismiss. And the closer this gets to reality, the more uncomfortable it becomes for the people who are certain it was over. Because if this comeback happens, it won't just rewrite one career. It will challenge how the entire system reacts to controversy. And that's a much bigger story than anyone expected. And that bigger story is exactly why the next phase doesn't move like a normal Hollywood comeback. It moves like something calculated, something that understands timing better than hype. Because hype fades, but timing changes outcomes. And right now, everything about Johnny Depp suggests he isn't chasing noise. He's waiting for impact. What most people miss is how rare it is for someone to step outside the system and still remain relevant inside it. Usually, when actors lose major studio backing, they fade into smaller circuits permanently. But here, the opposite started happening. The more distance there was from mainstream Hollywood, the more curiosity grew. And curiosity is the first step toward demand. His work outside the typical blockbuster space wasn't random. Projects in European cinema, artistic collaborations, and music performances weren't just side moves. They were signals. Signals that he didn't need permission to stay active. And that kind of independence shifts perception in a powerful way. Because when someone no longer looks dependent, they become harder to ignore. At the same time, the memory of what he had already built didn't disappear. Characters, performances, cultural impact. Those things don't vanish just because the headlines change. Especially when it comes to something like Captain Jack Sparrow, a role that became larger than the films themselves. It wasn't just acting. It was identity. And that identity stayed alive through audiences, not studios. This is where the industry faces a quiet dilemma. Because replacing a character is easy on paper, but extremely difficult in reality when the audience refuses to accept it. Discussions across platforms kept circling back to one point. No matter what direction a new film could take, the absence of the character would always be felt. Not as nostalgia, but as a gap. And gaps in storytelling cost attention. Attention is currency, and currency drives decisions. Behind closed doors, this kind of pressure doesn't get ignored. Executives look at numbers, trends, engagement metrics. They don't rely on opinions alone. They rely on patterns. And the pattern here was unusual. Instead of fading, interest was stabilizing, even growing in waves whenever his name re-entered conversation. That's not normal for someone who is supposedly finished. And that's where the idea of a return starts shifting from risky to strategic. Because now, it's not about bringing someone back out of sympathy. It's about capitalizing on something that still has strong market value. And market value, in entertainment, is the most honest measure of relevance. But here's where things get even more layered. Because a comeback at this level isn't just a business move. It's also a narrative move. The story of being removed, challenged, and then returning stronger. That storyline carries its own weight, and audiences connect to that. Not because it's perfect, but because it feels real. Coverage from platforms like BBC News and continued analysis from the New York Times kept highlighting how the public conversation around the case and its aftermath became a reflection of larger cultural shifts. How quickly opinions form, how quickly they spread, and how difficult it is to reverse them once they're established. But reversal isn't impossible. It just requires time, consistency, and the right moment. And that moment feels closer now than it did before. Because the silence that once looked like absence now feels like buildup. Every appearance, every mention, every rumor carries more weight than it normally would. Not because of frequency, but because of scarcity. Scarcity creates value, and value creates leverage. So if negotiations ever reach a serious stage again with a major studio like the Walt Disney Company, the dynamic won't be one-sided. It won't be about asking for a role back. It will be about redefining how that role returns. Maybe it's a continuation. Maybe it's a final chapter. Maybe it's something completely unexpected. But whatever it is, it won't be casual. It will be positioned as something that acknowledges everything that happened before it. And that's what makes it powerful. Because instead of ignoring the past, it uses it. And that's what turns a comeback into a statement. But not everyone is comfortable with that kind of return. Because if someone can go through that level of public collapse and still come back stronger, it raises uncomfortable questions. About how decisions are made, about how quickly people are judged, about how narratives are formed and then accepted as truth. And Hollywood doesn't like being questioned. It prefers control. Which is why this situation stands out. Because control, in this case, slipped. The story wasn't contained. It wasn't shaped entirely by studios or headlines. It was influenced by millions of people watching, reacting, analyzing in real time. And that kind of exposure changes the rules. It creates accountability, whether the system likes it or not. And accountability leads to hesitation. Because the next decision can't be rushed the same way the previous ones were. This time, everything is under a microscope. Every move, every announcement, every partnership. All of it will be examined more closely than before. And that pressure changes behavior. It forces caution, but it also creates opportunity. Because if done right, this return doesn't just restore a career. It reshapes how comebacks are handled in the future. And that's where the idea of a savage return becomes real. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise. A return that doesn't just happen. It lands. And when it lands, it sends a message. That being removed doesn't always mean being erased. That time doesn't always weaken relevance. Sometimes it strengthens it. And that the same audience that once watched a downfall can also witness a rise. But the final piece of this story hasn't been revealed yet. Because everything so far, the silence, the shift, the build-up, it's all leading to a single moment, a moment where speculation either becomes reality or disappears completely. And the closer that moment gets, the more one question starts to dominate everything else. If the door fully opens again, who will actually control what happens next? Who controls what happens next is the one question that changes everything. Because control decides whether this becomes a simple return or a complete shift in power. And right now, all the signs suggest that Johnny Depp is no longer in the same position he was before everything collapsed. Before, the system dictated terms. Studios approved, projects aligned, contracts followed a predictable structure. But after everything that happened, that structure doesn't hold the same weight anymore. Because once someone has gone through public removal at that level and still maintained global attention, they stop being just another actor. They become a symbol. And symbols don't negotiate the same way. This is where things start getting strategic in a way most people don't see. Because if a return to something like Pirates of the Caribbean ever becomes official, it won't just be about stepping back into a role. It will be about how that role is framed, how the story is told, and most importantly, who benefits the most from it. Because let's be honest, the character of Captain Jack Sparrow isn't just another part. It's a cultural asset. A character that shaped an entire franchise and influenced how audiences view modern adventure films. And when a character reaches that level, bringing it back becomes more than a creative decision. It becomes a business event, and business events are negotiated carefully. The difference now is leverage. Before everything happened, studios had more control because they controlled access. Now, access isn't the same barrier. Global platforms, independent projects, international markets. All of these have expanded what's possible outside the traditional system, and that gives more flexibility to someone who already has global recognition. So if negotiations happen, they don't start from a position of loss. They start from a position of value, and value changes tone. Instead of asking for approval, it becomes about setting conditions, creative input, financial structure, narrative direction. These are the kinds of elements that come into play when someone returns at this level. Because a comeback like this doesn't just need to succeed. It needs to justify itself. It needs to feel earned. And that's where storytelling becomes critical. Because audiences won't accept a simple reset. They won't ignore what happened and pretend nothing changed. They want acknowledgement, even if it's subtle. They want to feel like the return has meaning, not just profit behind it. And that's a delicate balance. Too much focus on the past, and it feels heavy. Too little, and it feels disconnected. Finding that balance is what turns a return into a moment. And moments create impact. Industry coverage has continued to reflect this tension. Outlets like The Variety and The Hollywood Reporter have repeatedly highlighted how studios are more cautious now in handling high-profile controversies, especially after seeing how public opinion can shift over time. The lesson is clear. Reacting too fast can have long-term consequences. And this situation became one of the clearest examples of that. Because what was once treated as a closed chapter slowly reopened. Not because of a single event, but because of consistent shifts in perception. Interviews, trial coverage, audience reactions. All of it contributed to a gradual re-evaluation. And re-evaluation creates second chances. But second chances don't guarantee the same outcome. They create a new version of it. Which is why the idea of a savage return isn't about going back to the past. It's about redefining the future. Doing things differently, on different terms, with a different level of awareness. And awareness is the key here. Because both sides understand the stakes now. Studios know the value of the story, but they also know the risk of misreading the audience again. And on the other side, there's a clear understanding that returning without control could repeat the same cycle. So everything slows down. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything matters more. Every discussion, every proposal, every possibility, all of it carries weight. And while the public sees rumors and speculation, the real movement happens quietly, behind closed doors, through conversations that never get officially confirmed. This is how major decisions in Hollywood are made. Not through announcements, but through alignment. Alignment between value, timing, and narrative. And right now, all three are getting closer. Value is there because the audience never fully disconnected. Timing is aligning because enough distance has passed for perception to shift. And narrative is stronger than ever because the story itself has evolved beyond controversy into something bigger. Something about resilience, perception, and control. And the combination is rare. Which is why this doesn't feel like a normal comeback. It feels like something that could set a precedent. Because if someone can go from being completely removed to negotiating from a position of strength, it changes how future situations are handled. It forces studios to think longer, react slower, and consider the long-term impact of short-term decisions. And that's a shift in power. But here's the final layer that makes this even more intense. Nothing is guaranteed. No matter how strong the signals are, no matter how much demand builds, until something becomes official, it remains a possibility, not a certainty. And that uncertainty is what keeps the tension alive, because it means the story is still being written. Every rumor, every hint, every piece of coverage adds to the anticipation. Not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled build-up. Like something is forming, slowly but deliberately. And when something builds like that, it usually leads to a single defining moment. A moment where everything becomes clear. Either the return happens and redefines the narrative completely, or it doesn't, and the silence takes on a different meaning. But if it does happen, if the door fully opens, it won't just be about one actor returning to one role. It will be about proving that being cancelled isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of something far more powerful. If you've watched this entire journey unfold, then you already know this isn't just about one actor. It's about how fast someone can be written off and how strong a comeback can be when the story isn't over yet. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Johnny Depp will actually return as Captain Jack Sparrow, or is this all just build-up with no final move? Drop your opinion below because this conversation is far from finished. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, make sure you're locked in right here because the next story might be even bigger.